So here we are, the middle of November. I've been running trials in these composting bins since the beginning of April. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the trials that I've done, the experimentation, the results, and I'm going to go through the basics of how do you get your compost pile started and manage things like aeration, water, nitrogen. So I'd like to just take a step back again and start off with a little bit of, once again, why do you want to convince yourself to go through the process and take the time and the work that is needed to make high quality finished compost. I'd like to go back, as one thing I mentioned in my first video was the what happened to my trailing petunias in the hanging baskets that I made. So that was really a catalyst for further research, knowing there was something horribly wrong, because the potting soils that I purchased did not do the same thing. And the funny part of that whole story was the hanging baskets, because they're isolated, they're not connected to the rest of the earth. They're really separate. So the effects of the improperly finished compost were more pronounced. And as I did my research, the one thing that I realized is, at first I didn't realize that the same problem was happening in my garden soil, because it was attached to the ground, to the rest of the soil, and the problems or the things that were not working well, or diseases or pests and things like that were affecting some of my other plants. When you go to gardening books, you talk to fellow gardeners, you go to gardening centers, and you try to find out what's the cause of this problem, or what's the cause of this condition. And often the information that you're getting is, you need to add a supplement, you need to change this, you need to rotate your crops. There's all kinds of answers to help you manage with those problems. And the funny part about it is most of those problems are all related to the health of the soil and putting partially or undecomposed organic matter into the soil. So being the middle of November here, and having already had quite a lot of frost below freezing temperatures, there's not a lot left growing in my garden. So I'm going to use this row that I planted a regenerative crop or winter crop in to well, I'll explain why. So let's take that step back. As what I said is there, the reality is putting organic matter into your soil, specifically organic matter that comes from plant growth that is above the soil level. So when I was talking in the first video about the regenerative agriculture movement using plant crops to enrich in the soil and create organic matter, so what they're really talking about is the root mass. Now, when the plant dies in nature, the root that's in the ground behaves differently than the plant material above ground as it dies and decomposes. So when you take organic material and either work it directly into your soil, which some people do, they call it green manures or green crops, and they turn that into their soil, or you take partially decomposed organic matter from your compost pile or manure pile, whatever, the working that into the soil is is different from how nature decomposes those organic materials. Nature decomposes them on the surface. The roots decompose in the ground. Now, the funny thing is from a scientific standpoint, there is no good scenario ever for putting organic matter or partially decomposed organic matter into the soil. And the simple reason why it can be misleading, because people will say, yes, I turn my green crop into the soil and my plants do well. I put my compost to whatever degree it is decomposed into the soil and my plants do well. Yes, you will have some good results. The main reason is because this organic matter is releasing a lot of nutrients. So your plants are able to take up a lot of nutrients quickly and you have productive growth. However, when you talk to those same people, they're always concerned about pests, disease, crop rotation. There's a whole, they'll tell you that their garden was really productive, yet if you talk to them long enough, there's all these other problems. And the very simplified answer to why organic matter is a net negative when it's in your soil is that, and again, this is, as I said, it's really hard to find reliable scientific information and be able to apply that information to what you're doing practically. But there's, in general, the basic simple explanation is when you put organic matter into your soil and it's decomposing, the organisms that are breaking that material down are not necessarily the same species of organisms that are working with your plants and thriving off of the sugars that your plants put into the ground to feed that soil biology and keep it healthy. So you're having a competition. So what's happening is you're having incompatible microbes, putting it simply, competing for resources. One of them, everyone always talks about nitrogen, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and I'm going to say one of the most critical resources that is going to affect your plants and the health of your plants is the competition for oxygen. So most garden plants pretty much are aerobic, and all the biology that supports them are also aerobes. And when you have organic matter decomposing in your soil, I would, in my estimation, as to how fresh oxygen gets into your garden soil, that is one of the most critical elements or resources that is competed for. Secondly being water, nitrogen, and when you look at the people like Elliot Coleman and some of the regenerative agricultural people that are on, and some of the market gardeners, they're all talking about getting that soil healthy. And when you're working in your humus and your finished compost, you're creating an environment for the microbes or the soil biology that you want for your plants to thrive, and that simply outcompetes all the other unwanted things. And then you have disease and pest control, humidity management. You have something that'll hang on to the nutrients in the soil. You basically will eliminate a large percentage of the problems that small farmers and market gardeners and regular gardeners are facing when they're dealing with their plants. So my objective is to give you a broad understanding of, first of all, how this composting bin works and how composting and organic material behave in general, so that once you have that understanding, you will be able to make the necessary adjustments or adaptations to your climate and what specifically you are putting into your compost bin. So on the subject of climate, I would like to just quickly describe the climate that I live in. There's only about 2 months out of the year in the summer where the nighttime temperatures stay high enough for the soil to get significantly warm. That is a huge challenge for garden production and germination and a whole variety of things. I consider, in one sense, I'm lucky because, as I was talking about, the net negative effect of putting fresh organic matter or partially decomposed organic matter into your soil being a net negative, because I have such a short period of warm enough temperatures to get that soil biology at its peak. The lucky part of it is that the negative effects of what I'm talking about in where I live are more pronounced. It's more obvious because in a warmer climate, the negative effects are spread out over a longer period of time because your soil's warmer and it may be harder to see what I'm seeing. So you're going to have to go ahead, fill up your composting bin and get some experience, and to have some practical experience onto how does this composter work and how are the materials behaving inside your composter, how is the climate where you live affecting what's going on. What I would suggest is I'm assuming that right now I'm talking to people who have already been composting or have tried composting and they know some basics. Whatever composter or method you've been using, I really think that the best thing that you could do is take exactly what you've already been doing and put it into this composting bin. I think you're going to learn a lot quicker if you do that, because what you're going to have is you're going to have all the things that you've already been doing in this design, and you're going to see a significant difference in what's going on in there. And you'll know that it's this composter that is making the difference, not something that you've changed into what you've put in your pile. If you understand what I mean, I'll give you an example. At the very beginning of April, I started constructing this. As soon as I had 2 bins set up, I put material in that I had accumulated over the previous, I think, about 3 years. All the material that I accumulated from the composting trials, I kept putting it into different composters and trying different things with it. Only a small portion of it actually ended up in my garden. So at the beginning of April, I had this big pile, or this big amount of compost that I already tried composting. Most of that never heated up. Some of it did for a very brief period of time, but never got into the hot range or sustained the hot range. So when I put it into these 2 bins early in April, which is still quite cold here, I made sure that there was some nitrogen added to it as I put it in there, and the piles heated up. They heated up to the hot temperatures. The hot temperatures were within a few, like 2 or 3 inches of the edge, and I was able to sustain that hot temperature without turning or touching the pile for about 6 weeks. So that was an amazing contrast between everything else that I tried, yet using the same material in this new system. So I knew I was onto something. So the next thing I'd like to say is I'll just give you an idea of what I'm composting. And again, I'm probably talking to people who are having a mixed pile in general. So in the springtime, there's not a lot of green growing vegetation yet to put in. So you go around with a lawnmower. There are some weeds and some plants that have been growing. I chopped up a lot of leaves. I had some animal inputs because I had 10 chickens here, so I was using wood chips for the bedding in the coop and cleaning that out and putting that in. Animal inputs are not necessary to have good quality finished compost. I had some leaves that were stockpiled from the year before, and so as the season progressed, the composition of my piles changed slightly because I had more green growing. I had weeds and grass clippings. For me, grass clippings include a tremendous amount of weeds. I don't have a manicured yard, so I have a lot of weeds and a lot of non-grass plants and a lot of weed seeds also. As I said, one of the benefits of the hot process, the hot stage, is the destruction of weed seeds. So my oldest compost, in the spring when I start my sprouting bed to start my plants for the garden, I'll be able to take some of that compost, put it into a sprouting tray, and just see visually, is there any seeds left in that pile that was in the hot stage for about 2.5 months. So that'll be interesting to see. Another thing is, I wished I had a very advanced pile of compost to show you, and I will show you my oldest pile in a minute. What I would like to say is, my concern this year in the trials that I did were to challenge my design, and most of the compost piles that I built, I disrupted them, I overdosed them, I did all kinds of things that really slowed down the composting process, but it was necessary because I knew that I wanted to share this idea with other people. So good science you don't make one trial in something and then just assume it's great. You put it through all kinds of tests and experiments, and the more times you do that, the more confidence you can have to say, yes, this is a really good setup for its size and purpose. So I'm going to go through some of the experiments that I did do and explain them to you and the results, so that you can use this information to, when you start your composting, you're going to have an understanding of what to look for, what to do, what not to do, and you'll probably arrive at finished compost sooner than I will, in a sense. I can say that I started a couple of bins towards the end of the summer, and they're almost as far along as the earlier ones that I started, simply because I did not disrupt or distress those piles with some of the experiments. Okay, so you're putting material into your compost pile. Whatever that is, there are three main things that you're going to have to manage and learn to manage with your climate and the materials you put in. So one is humidity, one is the nitrogen content, and the other one is the aeration of the pile. So let's talk about humidity first. As you're putting your material in, you're going to have to get a sense of, typically in the early stages, you're going to have to add water as you're building your pile. Scientifically, the ideal humidity in a compost pile is 50 to 60%. humidity, not 50 to 60% water, 50 to 60% humidity. And as I've said, I am trying to keep my operation low tech, so it can take a little bit of experimentation to get to know what does 50 to 60% humidity look and feel like when you're turning your compost pile. The one thing I will say though about this composting setup is the piles have consistently dried out or been very dry from the halfway point down. So the thermodynamics is working very well. So all the hot moist air is rising up, and in the idea of trying to keep the hot stage going and turning your pile less, which is the objective. So I tried several different methods of adding water as the weeks go by, and what I finally came up with is I made this tool. It's a 3/4 inch copper pipe. I found this in the garbage as it was, with a valve on it. I attach it to my garden hose, and all the other methods of watering, I was putting water from the top, and I found that it just kept the top too wet and the water wasn't getting down far enough. So what I do is I go in, and you will have to come up with your own watering schedule. Again, if the air on the outside is cooler, hot moist air is leaving the pile faster, your pile could dry out faster. If you're in a hot dry climate, evaporation is going to be faster. If you're in a cool damp climate, whatever, I chose to water it once a week, to add water. And what I do is I stick this part way into the pile, I open the valve, I count. So what I did is I took this tool, I put it in a bucket, I opened the valve, and then I counted to see what the count was to get a liter of water or a quart of water, whatever, so that I had some idea of how much water I was adding into the pile. So when I do turn it, I was able to say, okay, this is still really dry, I could add more water, or there's humidity throughout the pile, I'm at the right amount of water to add. So you put it in part way, at least this far below the surface. I open the valve, I count, I put the probe further down, I count, I put the probe further down, but not too close to the bottom, because then the water just simply drains out. Then I turn it off, pull it out, and I repeat. I do it, every 6 inches or so, maybe 4 or 5 rows. I've tried giving a little bit more water towards the center where it stays hotter, and I finally came up with I do it weekly, and roughly how much water I add till the point where when I turn the pile, the lower half still had humidity. So the next thing is the air getting into the pile. So I found here in my climate that I did not need to open these vents halfway up, the 1.5 inch space at the bottom, and when it was hot in the summer, the inch gap in each corner with the lids completely on was enough to keep the pile from overheating. I did let a couple of piles overheat, and I'll talk about that in a second. Just to finish off with the air ventilation controlled, and what I had here, no pile showed any signs of lacking air or oxygen. So the system for this size of pile, the amount of air getting into it was adequate. I did try a couple of piles in the hot time of summer where I closed the corner gaps, and they overheated. And what was really interesting is one of the piles overheated. It reached almost 170 degrees, and it stayed there for several days. I think it was like 3 or 4 days. And then all of a sudden the whole pile cooled off, and it took quite some time for it to recover from that and heat up again. So it probably killed off quite a few of the microbes, and it took some time to repopulate. The other pile that overheated, it was about 164 degrees for about a week. And what the funny thing was the center of the pile cooled down to about 120 degrees, while the outside of the pile stayed at 140 degrees. So that was also very interesting. Basically, after those two piles, I did another pile, and there was a very little gap in the corners. I didn't have the full inch that I was talking about because the nights were cooling off. And when it did start to just go over 160 degrees, all I did was open the top for half of the day for 2 or 3 days, and that was enough to keep it from overheating. And after those few days, the temperature stayed below 160, and it was fine. So as I said, if you have your compost thermometer, and I'll show you a picture of mine close up. It's Kate's Garden. It's a compost thermometer, and just so we're talking about the same temperature ranges, it says warm is from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The active is from 100 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hot is from 130 to 160. So when I talk about warm, well, actually I like to say more cool, warm, and hot. However, here they're saying warm, active, and hot. Let's debunk some of the myths that people are constantly talking about on their composting videos and in composting instructions. Once you get your pile heated up, do not touch it. Don't go in there and move it around and get air in there. Don't touch it. Most people are talking about, oh, my pile went anaerobic, and I have to mix it to get air in there so it doesn't smell and doesn't do that. No, this is this composting bin changes all of that, because you get to the hot temperatures, and the moisture will equalize itself. Do not touch the pile. I want to say quickly, turning intervals, I can't say definitively yet. Yes, you should turn it in 6 weeks or 4 weeks or 8 weeks. Again, the reason is that the trials that I've done, I was testing out and stressing different things. But I'm going to guess with a mixed pile that, is it better to turn it while it's in the hot stage? Is it better to wait till it cools down? I'm working on that. But I would suggest that you wait at least 4 to 6 weeks before you turn your pile the first time, as long as it's been sustaining those hot temperatures. And then you can carefully take a couple inches off the top, a few inches off the side, and make sure that gets incorporated into the center, and the bottom, until it gets warm in the summer, the bottom stays cooler. So once you turn the pile, all the material in the bottom is going to be near the top, and it's going to get exposed to those hot temperatures. So I believe that by the time you turn your pile for the third time, that majority, like 99% of the material in that pile, will have been exposed to hot temperatures for more than 2 weeks. Another quick thing about filling your pile. So what I found was that I start filling one pile when I'm collecting my mixed inputs, and as you start getting your pile, sometimes I've filled them up, the same day, because I got grass clippings, I cleaned out the chicken coop, and it was very quick to fill a pile. As it heats up and begins to decompose, get a lot of shrinkage. And so what I've been doing is, once the bin is full, I go ahead and start my second bin, and as the pile begins to settle, I go back to that pile and add more organic matter. The reason for that is there's a lot of shrinkage in the beginning, and you want to make sure that as your pile progresses and you start turning it, that when you do turn it, that it is as full to the top as possible, because as the pile begins to cool and not reach those hot temperatures, so by the time you turn it the third time, I found that, and again, I did this as an experiment. I had two piles that were down a little bit. So when I turned them, I took one. I turned the first pile, and then I took material from the second bin to top up the first pile to make sure it was full, and it left the second pile that I turned, quite a bit lower, maybe 2/3 full. And so I observed the temperatures, and the full pile heated up to about 110, 120 degrees fairly quickly, and the other one that was low really struggled to heat up. I experimented with gathering some organic material. It was mostly grass clippings and really fine wood shavings that I got from cutting firewood, and some leaves, and I chopped it all up and filled up the bin. And then I was able to, the top section got to the hot temperatures, but then I dug down and I tried to see if the lower part started to warm up, because the bin was filled up to the top, and yes, it did make a difference. I don't recommend putting fresh organic material in after the material you've had has already had 6 to 12 weeks of hot temperatures. I don't recommend that you put more organic material in. So I just did that as again to confirm the theory that this bin, to function properly, needs to be as full as possible. So pay attention, as I said, fill the bin as it shrinks, put more material in there, and the shrinkage will slow down, and you'll have a full bin or close to full every time you turn it. Now the next thing is nitrogen. So first I want to cover real quickly this obsession, or a lot of people who are doing composting videos seem to be fixating on the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Carbon being high, nitrogen being low. I think it's 30-1 is the one that's quoted. So if you look at the scientific information, the good stuff, the reliable stuff, if you read it carefully, what they're really talking about in that ratio is to start the pile off. Now the main reason you want to keep the nitrogen low is because in a new pile you have a low population density of microbes and you have no humus. So as organic matter that has a lot of nitrogen in it begins to decompose and release that nitrogen, and there's nothing in the pile to take it up or hang on to it, then it's just lost back into the atmosphere. So if you have a higher nitrogen content in comparison to carbon, it's not the end of the world. What's really going to happen is you're going you're probably going to lose a lot of that nitrogen into the atmosphere. So on that point, I want to say something about wood chips right here, and I'm going to talk more about wood chips after. So people have this idea currently, and it's a very popular idea, that you need to put wood chips or some kind of wood material into your pile to get that carbon ratio up, to get the higher carbon content. That is also a very not inaccurate, not false, but it's a very misleading piece of information. If you listen carefully, a lot of times people are talking about grass clippings as being something that it doesn't work, or food scraps, they don't work. Your pile gets mushy and stinky. All right. The main reason for that is your pile's too small and it's not heating up. So I'm going to get back to that in a second. So basically how plants work is they take in CO2, they fix it, and release oxygen. So any plant that has been growing for more than a few weeks is beginning to fix a lot of carbon or CO2. Any stocky plant, grains, corn, beans, even tomato plants, any plant that has structure and stockiness to it has a considerable amount of carbon in it. And like with a grain plant, as the grain plant matures, like a corn plant, you get more and more stocky material and less green material. So there is a tremendous amount of carbon in those materials. There's a lot of carbon in leaves. You can keep your leaves in a pile over winter, and then introduce them into with your green material. You don't have to have wood chips, okay? So, to wood chip or not to wood chip? That is a very good question. Currently, there's a popular belief that wood chips or some kind of wood component is necessary or vital in your compost pile in order to achieve a good quality compost, and that's just not really true. The reason this idea is because wood has a high carbon content, and people are fixating on the carbon to nitrogen ratio, where most of the problem is coming from the fact that their size of their pile is too small, and that there's nothing containing the heat and humidity as my composting bin does. So they think that they're going to, when their compost pile is stinky and anaerobic, they think that they're missing the carbon component and they're putting in wood chips. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about what are the negative aspects of wood components in your compost pile. So first off, in the pretty much all of the commercial composting operations that I personally saw, they're typically keeping the wood chips and wood products separate until it's reached a certain level of decomposition, and then eventually they're incorporating it in with all the other elements to create that final finished compost. So wood in general has some really negative aspects. First of all, just in general, certain trees are highly resistant to decomposition, and also certain parts of trees, mainly in the bark, where we're talking about saps and a few other fibers and compounds that a tree has that are also highly resistant or problematic for a compost pile. Less so if your compost pile is heating up to the hot stage and sustaining that. So a lot of those, the saps and the bark compounds can be broken down in the hot process. But in general, also some byproducts of wood decomposition are also problematic for incorporating into your soil afterwards. So it's it's a controversial thing, these wood chips. So one thing that I've decided after the trials that I've done this year, using using the wood chips as they are, as I get them from the tree service. Some of the wood chips that I incorporated into the composting bins had already been here from the season before, from last year, and some of them were fresh. So what I've decided was that I'm no longer going to use the wood chips as they are. I'm going to shred them up more. I do this with my push mower. That is a bagging push mower, and I have gone over them and it's chopped them up quite fine. The the lawnmower that I used, I had to modify it slightly. I had to increase the RPMs because the lawnmower comes the RPMs are a bit too low for the blade speed to be fast enough to break up these wood chips. And I'll be using these chopped up wood chips also for the bedding for my chickens next year when I start my chickens again. Now, a couple of the reasons why I'm going to do it this way, excuse me, isn't necessarily. I don't know if the hard to decompose components or the parts, the trees in here that are hard, the resistance to decomposition. I can't really say that they're going to decompose faster or easier, because I'll show you one of my older compost piles where the wood chips have been in the hot stage for at least I'd say 12 weeks, and a lot of them still look like wood chips. They're not, but when you grab them, they crumble and break apart quite easily, with the exception of a few, which I am assuming are from trees that are resistant to decomposition. And I've already looked ahead as to some point before I put this compost into my garden, I'm going to need to screen it because there's rocks and a few other things in there, and some big pieces of wood that I had in my mixes that I'm going to want to take out of there. The problem is the screening that I did, because I'm doing it by hand. Even the wood chips that when you grab them in your hand crumble, quite easily. With the screen, I found that I can't get enough force on the screen to get them to break up. So I just said, okay, I'm going to avoid that problem completely and shred them before I use them, so that there's going to be a lot less large pieces that I need to screen out or try to break up at the end of the composting process. So I was talking about this idea that is popular currently, that wood chips are a necessary or vital component to making or successfully producing high quality finished compost. And I've been saying that, well, that's not exactly true. I think the main reason for this kind of misunderstanding comes largely from the agricultural community. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking conventional, organic, permaculture, regenerative. The agricultural community are using wood chips as a tool to manage things like dead animals, animal remains as a byproduct of slaughter, and animal excrement in context of bedding and keeping animals indoors. And if you watch closely as to how they're setting up their composting processes to deal with these things, what they're really doing is using the wood chips as a tool to safely decompose all of those things and have no environmental contamination of the byproducts of the decomposition process until it's fully complete. This is not getting into the environment, and they're at the same time they're very successful at controlling pathogens and disease. And if you watch closely, for the majority of the people that are showing the use of wood chips in this way, they're not actually following through and finishing the compost and making finished compost for vegetable production. Most often, what they're doing is they're, once the animals and animal byproducts have completely decomposed and are safe to put back into the environment, they're spreading this out on the field, and any components that are still need further decomposition, they basically decompose when they're on the field. So I'd like to conclude the composting reality check part 2 right here. I still have far too much information to share and things to show you of what went on in this growing season, and I understand that my videos are very long, but there is no easy or short way to get all the very important information in one package. So I will see you soon, and thank you for watching.